Because I sent Fraser the reading earlier this week, and then 2 days ago realised I sent him the wrong one. And then woke up this morning and realised I'd sent him the wrong one again. So if this doesn't make sense to you, it certainly doesn't make sense to Fraser. So for those of you who want to follow it, we are going to be reading from, I think, Acts 17, verses 16 to 28. And you'll find it on page 1113 of the Bibles. So it's Acts 17, 16 to 28. It's one of those readings where I normally prefer someone else to read it because it's got those odd words. You know, so, but people have always said to me, don't worry about odd words because no one else knows how to pronounce them anyway. So, Paul in Athens. While Paul was waiting for them, and that is Silas and Timothy, in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as those in the marketplace by day, with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You're bringing strange ideas to our ears. We'd like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that you are very religious. I see that in every way you are religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription: to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples made by human hands. He's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. For one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed time in history and boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out to him and find him, though he is not far from any of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring." You know those moments in time when everything seems to come together, we don't know why. And I confess, and Fraser and I have been having these conversations the last few weeks, that I found things a bit difficult of late, and been having questions, and just my mind hasn't really been there. So in preparing today's service, I confess that I was really struggling, despite this being a passage that I love. But Fraser convinced me that to do this. And then the first song you sang today, Heart of Worship, it was like God ordained, because I remember that song so perfectly, because I had become a Christian just a few months beforehand, and we'd gone to Spring Harvest for the first time. And I've sat there in a tent with 10,000 people with all the doubts in the world, thinking it was always a nice experience. It was nice, but it was that. But I then started to have those doubts. And they played that song. And I looked round at 8,000 Christians singing their heart out, and I thought, they can't all be wrong. And it changed my walk. It took me back to where God had always wanted me to be. And for me, this is one of the most important pieces of scripture we will ever have on the question of discipleship. It is one of the most important pieces of scripture on mission and outreach. It has a backstory that goes back hundreds, possibly thousands of years before the reading we have. It has nuances to it that we can't even begin to unpack today. We could preach this passage for the next week and still we wouldn't touch the surface. So my prayer today is that these would not be my words, but God's words. Now it seems to me that Jesus was a rather good storyteller. Indeed, if you think about it, Jesus told more stories than he gave sermons. It's got something to say for us on a Sunday. Sorry. Okay. So I want today to speak through some of the stories and the message that was inspired by these days in Athens that we had in this reading. But most of all, perhaps, inspired by a number of events that took place actually about 2,000 years later, between 2000 and 2016, 5,200 miles away from Athens, in a place called Kenya. I want to take us to say that today there are two things I want us to take on board. And they're these. Two things that I think we can take today from Paul in Athens. One, we must listen to understand the cultures in which we operate. Not cultures, cultures. It was always said, wasn't it, that about the generation gap, parents to children. The reality is there's now a generation gap every 5 years. Different culture every 5 years. The second thing is the message of the gospel is always good news. That never changes. But sometimes the way we share it must. So a little of the background. These events took place on Paul's second great missionary journey, one that took him far and wide. But before he comes to Athens itself, we see Paul getting himself into a whole load of problems. Acts 16 in Philippi, and Paul's action and words land him in a prison cell. Acts 17, and in Thessalonica, his words and actions start a riot. He only goes on another 8 verses to Berea, and he's in more trouble again. Now, to be honest, I've worked in a number of churches that were not easy. Sharon would say that's an understatement. But hopefully, I never started a riot in any of them. If I had, I may have questioned my calling. But Paul is much stronger than that. He's made a stronger stuff. And he heads, despite everything that has happened, to Athens. Now we need to understand Athens, where Paul is heading. Athens was a magnificent city. It had the most magnificent buildings. You just imagine those things you see on TV of how Athens is now. Imagine what it was like when those buildings went up. It was the absolute centre of Greek culture. It was the absolute centre of Greek philosophy. It was the centre of Greek education. Some described it as the learning capital of the world. It was magnificent. But it was also a city where it was once described as having more gods than men. It had more gods than men. And in this centre, 2 dominant philosophies are at work. The Epicureans and the Stoics. Epicureans believed that everything in the world was made up of atoms. That everything was governed by physical laws. Happiness and pleasure came by submitting to the laws of nature. Though they figured, gods do exist, but the gods were so far away that actually religion had no real part in their lives. And then there was the Stoics. They believed that God was everywhere, in nature, in the universe, in man. Therefore, to live in harmony with the universe was to mean you submitted to the will of a divine being. Now, it's into those two complete contradictions that Paul is to step and to speak. Now, his history suggests here that this could have ended up in a bit of a disturbance and disagreement. And here, this is important for us. Most of us, if we're honest, avoid a direct approach when it comes to witnessing for Jesus. We worry about offending, especially in this day and age when it seems to be that so many people seem able to take offence at so many different things. We're worried about offending. We prefer that indirect, more subtle approach. We want to believe that what we're going to say might at least be heard. And perhaps, just perhaps, Paul had reflected on something similar here. You see, Paul had planted many churches by now, but he'd also created, almost wherever he went, a lot of consternation. Here was a place where different cultures and different worldviews already existed. And that's before Paul steps in. He needed a different approach. Remember what I said at the beginning. Good news never changes, but the way we present it sometimes has to. So here, just for a second, I want to step away. Step away from Athens to Kenya in 2005. Sharon, Tina and I were in Kenya for the first time in our lives. We knew nothing, but we prepared the best we could. After all, we were actually really experienced in preaching and youth work. We went out fairly confident. Oh boy, how wrong we could have been. You see, we took out, first of all our youth work resources and ideas, all those games, all those toys, all that sort of thing. Only to find out, as no one had told us, that in most parts of Africa and Kenya, youth means 20 to 40 years of age. First problem. So then, having realised that actually we can't do all these games with them, I then get asked instead, go and preach to them. But you've got no time to prepare. You just got to go and do it. Oh, and by the way, over here, when we do a sermon, it lasts between 2 to 3 hours. How lucky you are. And then at the end of the 2 to 3 hour sermon, you get this bit where the preacher is asked theological questions from the congregation. It's not a clue we do this here, by the way. And to be honest, most of the questions were quite easy. And I was getting quite confident. I'll be honest, I was getting quite arrogant. I thought, I've got this nailed. But then that dreaded word arose. There's only one dreaded word for me when it comes to being asked theological questions. Revelation. My heart sank. I was asked a question, I didn't even understand the question, let alone what the answer was going to be. So I promised to give an answer the next day when I was back preaching again. That day came, and I was still in this British white mode, got this nailed. I asked the person, do you have the question? Yes, ask it again. And I gave an answer. And this man, he was impressed. And you start to feel, nailed it. He was impressed. What he was not impressed with was the next answer. Because he said to me in front of the whole congregation, oh, fantastic, how did God reveal this to you? Oh, my wife told me, I said. If only I had had Paul's wisdom. You see, the men now were in uproar, because women aren't supposed to know anything over this day's part. And the women, they've just been affirmed so much that they leave the church dancing around the village with palm leaves. I joke you not, do I? It was incredible to see. But still, a few days later, despite all these mishaps, I still haven't learnt. I was like Paul and asked to preach as Paul was here in the village square. It was awful. I preached as you would over here. You know, the nice Christian message. It's not what their culture wanted. They wanted far more sort of fire and brimstone. It was awful. It was bad. And Sharon, being a good Christian wife, who always told me the truth, and yes, she said love, it was bad. It's a good way to sort of build you up, isn't it? So when I was asked to preach again the next day, I told the minister there, no, it was awful. I'm not doing it. Oh, it wasn't that bad, he said. I said, honestly, you weren't there. If you can give me one reason or persuade me that it wasn't that bad, I will do it. Well, he said, I can prove it to you. How's that? I said to him, he said, because the last person who was in that square preaching, they shot. Now I felt like Paul. I had not understood or acknowledged or even tried to adapt the way I was presenting the gospel to them in a village where false gods in the guise of witch doctors were still operating in that village. It was a lesson that I learnt, and a reason why Paul in Athens is so important to me. So back to Athens, and Paul's time to speak or to preach had come. Paul is now to speak on a low hill which is very near what you now know to be the Acropolis. From here, all those listening could have actually looked down upon the city from where they were, and they would have seen, as Paul knew, all these worthless false gods. They would have been in clear sight. Now, Paul himself, of course, comes from Tarsus, as we know. Tarsus itself was an educational centre. Paul was a rabbi. He was taught himself by the very finest scholar of the day. But Paul needed something else. And it seems Paul had learnt a tactic that we can learn today. He didn't go straight and preach. He starts off with, men of Athens, I noticed you're very religious because I was walking amongst you. In Athens, for the first time, Paul changes tact. He does not start by reciting Jewish history, as he normally did. To do this to the Greeks would have been absolutely pointless. You see, here, Paul had listened to the culture. And truly listening to what God is saying or providing is more than just listening with our ears for us today. To truly listen, we used to have an expression when I was an interview psychologist. We need to listen with intent to remember. Listen with intent to remember. Listening so that we show value. Listening so that we show respect. It's about more than words. It's about hearing and taking on board, being open and being able to respond. That involves not just our ears, but our eyes, our emotions, our feelings and our heart. It is trying to identify the signals that are coming to us. To disciple someone is more than listening. It's about hearing the whole person, their whole story. And when we talk about going into all the world to make disciples, that's one heck of a challenge. But Paul does it. Paul goes out, he listens, he looks, and he understands. He takes in the culture, he takes in the people, he takes in the beliefs. He sees what is missing, and having seen what is missing, he's got his opening. He has his opening. Paul does not change the gospel. But the way he delivers it, he does. Paul opens with those words that allow him an audience. The people who have accused him of babbling. You know, we have that word for babbling and we sort of think about someone just waffling on. But babbling literally meant someone who only has scraps of knowledge. Someone says that he was pushing a foreign religion. Literally the translation means that he was pushing demons. But despite that, he has an audience. No other opening, may have worked. Some might say, yeah, let's be honest, he was just creeping around a little bit at the start to him. So what? Paul got an audience by acknowledging their beliefs and their culture. Later he returns to it, because of course later on at the end of the reading we just had, it says, as one of your own poets said. Paul is giving them what they already know to introduce something that they don't. Paul was never ever submitting to the culture, never undermining his beliefs or the gospel, changes the way the message is delivered. It's a question that we might, as individuals and a church, need to ask. How might we, me, you and a church, we might learn from this? How can we change the way we deliver the gospel? But what is as important as the understanding of culture is what the culture is. It is one here of false gods, of icons. Or to reverse totally what they were saying, Paul was about to talk to them about their babbling demons. These false gods were so ingrained in the culture. They were part of daily life as far back as they could remember. So Paul picks on one of them. He doesn't pick on a god of war. He doesn't pick on the god of harvest. He doesn't pick upon the god of wealth or power. He says the unknown God. Now, being intellectuals, Greeks were opening to listen to new ideas, spoken with authority, as Paul was doing. He brings them the God that they could not name. You see, Greeks loved their God so much they didn't want to offend any. So in case they'd missed one out, they had the unknown God. It was their, as I call it, their just-in case God. So Paul brings them their just-in case God and introduces them to the God in whom we live and have our being. And he quotes their own poet, who has described the God in whom we are an offspring. And these words remain as radical today as they were then. For in him we live and have our being. That's what Paul says. Now, I didn't get that wrong. Paul is not introducing gods. He's not introducing to the Greeks or to us today someone who says to live with him. He says, but to live in him. This is not a God who lives upstairs with us in a sort of a lower room further down the staircase. This is not a God from another planet, but with us on earth. John 4:24 says, God is spirit. He is next to you. He's our wall. He's our foundation. This is not a God we talk about to discuss as a place to dwell. This is not a God to call on, but to reside within. Paul says, with him and in him we live and breathe and have our being. To me, that is radical, to say that we live in God. Paul takes the truth of God and brings it to a culture in a way that intrigued people. It intrigued them so much. If you go on to verse 33, you see the likes of Dionysius and Damaris. They are now on this road to being disciples. Some traditions have it that Dionysius, that you read about in verse 33, they go on to be the first bishop of Athens. This is the start of something radical. Paul here listens in Athens to the people, and they listen to him. He earned the right to be heard, and he did so using an unknown God. So before I sort of come to a sort of conclusion bit, I want us to go back to Kenya now, and it's now 2016. I'm due to preach again. Imagine how I'm feeling. But this is a Maasai church. The last time I visited, this church was around 60. Then in a place called Narok, it's now around 300. I had to get the message right. It's hard. Think of this. Many parts of Africa have no theology of end times. So that sort of rules out preaching from Revelation, Daniel and more. And the Maasai only eat meat and herbs. So that sort of rules out doing any of those sermons on farming. And Jesus walking on water, I thought that would be a good one. Problem is, Maasai rarely see water. It's a problem to have a message that fits them. So I prepared 3 different sermons. I thought, I'm going to be clever. I'm going to prepare 3 sermons. And I sent them over beforehand to my friend in Kenya. I said, okay, I want you to look at these and you choose the one that you think is best. Now we're driving 4 hours from Nairobi down to the place we're preaching. My sister and niece, both completely non-Christians, are with me. My friend Bessie has still not told me which one is best to preach. I'm getting annoyed by now, and I'm getting worried. I kept praying and praying and praying on the way down, promising God, whichever one Bessie tells me is the right one to use is the one I will preach, whether or not I like it or not. And as we approach the church, I'm now just saying to Bessie, we've got here now, it's too late, you need to tell me which one. And she looks up and said, if I were you, I would deliver the sermon you gave to another church a couple of years ago. Excuse me? I've sent you 3, and now you're telling me to deliver a 4th one that I don't even have with me. I had no notes. I couldn't remember many of the stories, but I had promised God that I would deliver the one that Bessie said was right. After all, it was more to her culture. But surely now, it was too late. I'm now struggling around for a piece of paper, and I tell you, I actually started writing the sermon with a bit of lipstick. That's all I had to write with. Well, the service came, and during it, this happens. Let me show the video. If you ever get a chance to go to a Maasai service, by the way, sell the house, sell the car, sell whatever, do it. In it, you probably just picked up the 2 white women. That is my sister and my niece. You also see 2 baskets on the chairs. One is for tithes, and one is for additional offerings. So some went forward, opened up their hands, and put nothing in. Now my sister thought it was a show. I explained to her that it's probably because Maasai don't generally deal in much in cash. It's quite hard to put a goat in a basket. But something said to me, before you preach, find out why it is to be right, and then tell my sister. So the pastor came and whispered in my ears. I was so tearful after it. It says so much for us about giving today. He said, many people who come here have nothing to give. So an empty hand is simply a promise to give all that they have. And all that they have is themselves and their very lives. An empty hand is not about giving money. It's about saying, I will give my life because it's all I have left. My sister, who was opposed pretty much to everything the church stands for, turned to me and said, if there were churches like that near me, even I would go. Culture touching lives. Now, it was my turn. And I kept my promise to deliver this sermon that I hadn't prepared, couldn't remember, couldn't really understand, and I was just trying to deliver it. At the end, the pastor of the sermon, the pastor came forward in tears. And I'm thinking, oh no, What have I done wrong now? Nothing, he said. But how did you know? How did you know? You know what I said? That here today are two sub-tribes who are almost at war with each other. They are tearing each other apart. We are really worried about this entire area. But as you spoke, their rifts were healed. The sermon that I had never intended to give was Love Keeps No Record of Wrong. After dozens came forward, which was another culture shock to me. I was used to preaching in churches of like half a dozen people, and you got all these people coming forward to give their lives to Jesus. Then the pastor and the church elders came, and he said this: you bring us a message, not a Western message, but one for us. You love us, but respect our culture as well. You respect our culture, so we offer you this. And at that moment in time, I was formally adopted as a Maasai. I was given my own name, my own belt, and my own robes. Formally as a Maasai, which means that you get access to things you can't normally do. To this day, I hold that moment as precious. It brought me to tears with the honour that it is. But let's be truthful. I did nothing. I had 3 other sermons prepared. God had done it all. Although I confess I do like to think that I had learnt from Paul, since my first preaching in Kenya, to understand culture. The false gods of revenge that day had been overcome and disarmed by bringing into the light the God who kept no record of wrong. And today we can learn even more in our communities from Paul. If we first listen with intent to remember and to respond, by listening to our communities, by seeing our communities, by bringing them not false deities, but the one true God. Just that next picture. The one true God. To the one following the God of consumerism, let me lead you to the God who says, I am enough. To those at risk of the false gods creating poverty, we can bring them the God who feeds thousands with fish and loaves. To the false gods of lust and sex, let me lead you to the God of true love. To the false gods who tell us, yeah, church is all right, you're doing all right, but you can't do much more. Let's bring ourselves to the God who says, I can do immeasurably more than you can even dream or imagine. To the false gods who tell us that we're never good enough, we take them to the God of Moses, the killer, David, the murderer, Peter, the denier. Let's even take them to Lazarus in a tomb. To the false gods who tell us in church, never change. We bring ourselves to the God of the Psalms who says, sing a new song. To those living under the guilt, we bring them to the God who says there is no condemnation in Jesus Christ. To the false gods of condemnation, we bring them to the God on a cross. Friends, there are many, many false gods in our world today. There are many gods who whisper in our ear for attention, but there is only one God who lived and died, was resurrected, and will come again. There is only one. That is your God, that is my God, that is our God. He stands at the door today and knocks and says, let me in. This is the God like Paul can, and we must believe in ourselves to show the world, because he is no longer unknown, and our community need to know his name. Listen to our communities. Understand our cultures. Be prepared to respond. And then let them know, as Paul did in Athens, their unknown God is really known. His name is love. And his name is Jesus.